Now, it took about 45 seconds from the time the bomb left the airplane until it exploded.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're breaking down the actions that unintentionally set the wheels of American history into motion.
Eisenhower finally came to the view, reluctantly, that Castro was an adversary and a danger.
Prohibition.
The audacity of the prohibition movement was that they believed that by the application of reason, morality, and religion, that you could change the habits of millions of Americans, that you could close down legal industries that brought in millions of dollars of revenue.
Looking back on it now, it's impossible to comprehend how the U.S. government thought that a ban on alcohol would be met with no resistance. The 18th Amendment, ratified in January 1919, was proposed as a way to cure societal ills and somehow stimulate the economy. The amendment thus outlawed the production, transport, and sale of intoxicating liquors such as wine and beer.
It could start with simple moral suasion, and of course that was very effective. But also they had newspapers, they had illustrations. They have many, many forms of reaching the public. They had handbills, they had posters. They had cartoonists who worked exclusively for prohibitionists.
Almost immediately, an alcohol black market was established, and those willing to bootleg the stuff not only profited, but essentially became folk heroes in the process. Eventually, in 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made good on his promise to end prohibition and restore the desperately needed tax dollars from alcohol sales as a means of combating the Great Depression.
Prohibition claimed that it would alter America in such ways that all sorts of reforms and social benefits would accrue, and they didn't.
Prohibition proved that you can't legislate morality. It is the only amendment to the U.S. Constitution that tried to control people's behavior and tell them you can't do this.
Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
At this time, it was necessary for the Mexicans to negotiate because they were afraid of losing all of their territory, or even more territory than that already occupied in the north.
The relatively short-lived Mexican-American War belied its length to generate important ripple effects over U.S. history. The war stemmed from tensions over the 1845 American annexation of Texas and President James K. Polk's failed attempts to buy the desired territory. The 1848 signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo saw Mexico ceding California, Nevada, Utah, and more to the United States, for which Mexico was paid $15 million.
When the war between Mexico and the United States was over, it left a profound frustration among the Mexican people, because common people, everyday citizens, had seen their neighbors, their brothers, and ordinary soldiers die in a war that, for all the bloodshed, had resulted in the loss of half of Mexico's territory.
While this all sounds diplomatic enough, unforeseen consequences most prominently included political infighting over whether the new territory would be slave states or free states. These debates contributed to the growing tensions between the American North and South and played a major role in the onset of the American Civil War.
There were others who shared Grant's opinion that the United States had been at fault.
And if not at fault, that it did not fully live up to its ideology as expressed in the noblest of the American writings on democracy and freedom.
The Great Depression.
The Great Depression was produced by a failure of government, by a failure of monetary policy. It was produced by a failure of the Federal Reserve System to act in accordance with the intentions of those who established it.
The tragedy of World War I was quickly offset by the indulgence of the Roaring Twenties. During this prosperous period, the United States became the world's richest country. Its wartime economy was bolstered by victorious soldiers rejoining the workforce and a consumer goods boom, among other factors. Of course, as the old saying goes, all good things must come to an end.
The facts were that from 1929 to 1933, the total quantity of money in the United States the amount of currency, the amount of bank deposits, what Mr. Eccles referred to as M2. That total amount of money declined by 1/3.
While the Depression's exact causes are still hotly debated by historians and economists, the 1963 book A Monetary History of the United States argues that the Federal Reserve's iron grip on the money supply and subsequent refusal to lend brought the Roaring Twenties to a screeching halt. There just simply wasn't enough money to go around.
And why did the quantity of money decline? It declined because the Federal Reserve System failed to prevent the decline. The Federal Reserve System could have prevented the decline at all times. There never was a moment during that period when the Federal Reserve did not have the power to prevent the decline in the quantity of money.
My Lai Massacre.
A South Vietnamese official, the military chief of Quang Ngai province, today denied charges that American soldiers on the ground executed several hundred villagers in March of 1968. The province chief said the civilians died in air and artillery strikes that leveled the village after a number of Americans had been killed there by Viet Cong snipers.
It probably goes without saying that the Vietnam War remains one of the most historically unpopular war efforts of all time. Beginning as a Cold War proxy between Soviet-supported North Vietnam and the American-supported South, the U.S. put soldiers' boots on the ground from 1965 until a humiliating 1973 withdrawal.
The villagers' version of the incident was given by survivors yesterday. They said a patrol of 100 Americans stormed into the hamlet, drove all the residents out of their huts, then opened fire with automatic weapons. 2 American soldiers, one an officer, the other an enlisted man, are being held in this country in connection with the case, but neither has been brought to trial.
In those 8 years, it's inarguable that the U.S.'s most shameful moment was the March 1968 My Lai Massacre, in which American forces brutally murdered as many as 504 civilians, mostly women, children, and the elderly. Despite an attempted cover-up by the U.S. Army, news of the senseless killings reached the public in November 1969, resulting in massive backlash against U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
I wanted to see action taken. I wanted to see the people who are responsible arrested. I think that the people who are primarily responsible have not been arrested. I think the people who are being arrested now are merely the pawns of the game. They're the people who, unfortunately, lack the presence of mind to refuse to execute this order.
George Washington's crossing of the Delaware River.
The key is absolute secrecy. We do not really have enough men for the task, but we have no choice. Coordinate with Griffin and attack on as many of their posts as possible. The more confusion we can spread, the better.
Some of the entries in our video today have been revealed as mistakes in a historical context. However, in the case of the Founding Fathers' surprise military operation, the attack was only possible because of a Hessian mistake. Hessians were German soldiers who worked on behalf of the British Army, and Johann Rall was a colonel stationed in Trenton, New Jersey.
We don't need trenches or fortifications. The rebel soldiers, those country clowns, they're almost naked, dying of cold, have no provisions, no blankets. Let them come. We shall welcome them with our bayonets.
The overconfident Rall failed to heed the word of a British spy who had foreknowledge of Washington's planned attack, dismissing the Americans' wartime capabilities. Ultimately, Washington's troops emerged victorious in the Battle of Trenton, and Rall soon died of injuries sustained during the fight.
Well, in military terms, it isn't a big deal. You lost 1,000 Germans, but you can always go hire another 1,000 Germans. But it's extremely important on the American side. As the news spreads to all the colonies, there is a feeling that it may indeed be possible to reverse the course of this war.
Trail of Tears.
The promises of the United States government were that if the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Seminoles, the Chickasaws could somehow assimilate ways of living that were more like their white neighbors, that they could be the political and social equal.
Whether you categorize the forced displacement of the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes as Native American genocide or an example of ethnic cleansing, it's impossible to deny that the Trail of Tears stands as one of the United States' most shameful chapters. Taking place over the course of 2 decades in the first half of the 19th century, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole nations were systematically removed from their ancestral homelands in favor of government-approved Indian Territory. Passed as a result of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, approved by President Andrew Jackson, the displacement saw 60,000 people uprooted, with as many as nearly 17,000 dying of disease and starvation along the way.
The state of Georgia basically said to its citizens, this land is yours. They divided up with a land lottery and basically told their people to have at it.
Bay of Pigs invasion.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation.
A defining moment of John F. Kennedy's all-too-short presidency. This now legendary blunder set the stage for relations between Cuba, the U.S., and the future Russia for decades to come. Following the Cuban Revolution, as led by the revolutionary Fidel Castro, the Bay of Pigs invasion was an effort by the U.S. government to remove Castro from power, as well as his socialist government.
The invaders had to hold a small piece of territory for a couple of days. Then the United States would recognize them as the new Provisional Democratic Government of Cuba. This new government of Cuba would immediately call upon the President of the United States to give them military support.
Once the invasion was discovered by the greater international community, the faltering military operation was swiftly defeated by the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. The painfully public fallout from the Bay of Pigs incident predictably soured relations between the U.S. and Cuba and drove the latter into the arms of the Soviet Union.
The Cubans were desperate to find some way to get the Soviet Union to guarantee their survival and their independence. Accepting Soviet missiles, for them, seemed like a guarantee.
Watergate Scandal.
I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Richard Nixon openly aspired to the presidency for years after serving as vice president, even weighing early retirement following humiliating losses in the 1960 U.S. presidential election and 1962 California gubernatorial election. However, his second term in office was cut short in 1974 following the explosive revelations of the damaging Watergate scandal.
The Democratic National Committee is trying to solve a spy mystery. It began before dawn Saturday when 5 intruders were captured by police inside the offices of the committee in Washington. The 5 men carried cameras and apparently had planted electronic bugs. One of them had several crisp new $100 bills in his pocket.
The work of Washington Post journalists Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward determined that Nixon had authorized the planting of illegal wiretaps at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C. The unveiling of the vast conspiracy led Nixon to become the only U.S. president to resign from his post.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad.
Ignoring Pearl Harbor warning signs.
On December 7, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it.
While most historians caution against falling too deeply into a Pearl Harbor conspiracy theory rabbit hole, there is evidence to suggest that the U.S. government could have taken possible threats more seriously. Yugoslavian businessman Duško Popov worked as a double agent for the XX Committee of MI5 and for the German Abwehr. The latter sent Popov on an American work trip with a questionnaire about Hawaiian military facilities, with specific questions about Pearl Harbor.
It just so happens the Germans were doing a little bit of work for the Japanese. The Japanese had asked the Germans to collect some data. The Americans had the equipment to actually magnify the microdot and to read the questionnaire. And wouldn't you know, the questionnaire included questions about Pearl Harbor.
FBI head J. Edgar Hoover dismissed Popov's claims, and it should be noted that the questions did not specifically allude to the possibility of such an air attack. However, it seems fair to say that Hoover could have taken Popov's warnings more seriously.
First to feel the sting of Japanese steel are the USS Oklahoma and Utah, the latter a 33-year-old target ship. Accurate hits by the enemy bombers make short work of these two naval bulwarks. Now, with their keels practically out of water, they lie helpless wrecks and a sad reminder of cowardly strategy.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I instantly recognized it as an American plane, as no Japanese aircraft could fly at that altitude at the time. It was just one plane, so I assumed that it was passing by as usual.
Like perhaps no other moment in American history, the August 1945 atomic bombings of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced the world to stand back in stunned silence and take notice. The only ever usage of nuclear weapons in combat, the strikes almost immediately resulted in Japanese surrender and ended World War II in just under a month. Altogether, up to nearly 250,000 were killed, almost all of them civilians, from radiation poisoning and other effects brought on by the detonations. While some have declared that the bombings were necessary to end the war, detractors have argued that the war was already on track for an Allied victory and that they were overkill.
I think when you play a meaningful part in bringing about the death of over 100,000 people and the injury of a comparable number, you naturally don't think of that as with ease.
Are there any historical blunders we missed? Be sure to let us know in the comments below.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.